Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Avent. I am a senior editor and economics writer with The Economist. And thank you for joining us for our panel today on resilience in an increasingly multipolar global economy. Before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping things we need to check off the list. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference sponsors, AIG, Diageo, IHS Markit, and the Henrik Foundation. So you know, the conference in this session is taking place on the record. The session is being recorded and will be available on Conference Plus on demand after the conference. You all may submit questions throughout the event. You can use the group chat function on the right-hand side of the Conference Plus platform in the group chat section. And then lastly, if you'd like to network with your fellow participants, you can browse the participant list via the networking tab, which is above this video. And you can choose to send a private message or start a one-to-one chat. If you need more information, full details on how to make the most of this can be viewed in the networking guide, which can be downloaded below this session. Thank you so much for being with us today. We are here to discuss the state of global trade. The world economy and the global trading system has been battered by a number of shocks over the past few years, from outbreaks of protectionism and economic nationalism to the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the strains that supply chains are under at this point. To discuss all of this with you, we have several wonderful panelists. We have Dr. Yui Jia, the Senior Research Fellow on China at the Asia Pacific Program, Masamichi Ito, the Director of Industrial Research at the Japanese External Trade Organization, and Stewart Paterson, Research Fellow for the Henrik Foundation. To begin the session today, we're going to give each panelist about 5 minutes to provide some opening remarks. And so Stewart, if you'd like to go first, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and welcome everyone. Let me start by saying that, you know, in terms of the shift in trade patterns that we've seen in recent years towards the Asia Pacific, it has of course been China that has been leading this, and other Asia Pacific countries have actually lost market share in exports over the last 20 years as a result of China's dominance. And the ramifications, I think, of China's growth have been manifold. First of all, obviously, the global trading system was not designed with the idea that you would have a non-market economy as the world's largest trading country. And that clearly has been a source of huge tension in terms of putting the institutional framework under a lot of pressure. And that, of course, has been augmented by a number of mercantilist policies that the Chinese have adopted, and they've adopted them very successfully if you look at it from their perspective. The exchange rate clearly is a non-market exchange rate, and that has had a very debilitating effect, in my view, in terms of preventing the natural international adjustment mechanism from working. And so we find ourselves in this position where China has run, substantial current account surpluses every year since 1993, and in doing so has obviously accumulated a large stock of overseas assets, at the expense of exchange rate adjustment, and the manifestation of that in the rest of the world, of course, has been extensive deflationary pressure. Which has had to be met by this abnormal monetary policy that has, first of all, it was zero interest rates, then QE, et cetera, which of course has had pretty debilitating impacts on our economies in the rest of the world, both in terms of asset price inflation and the social schisms that causes, and income inequality as well. And so we find ourselves in this juncture now where China has built this industrial base, which is at least twice as large as that is required to meet its own internal absorption of the output from that industrial base. And inevitably, that has put the global trading system under enormous strain. And in the last few years, of course, we've started to see that break down. So I guess the next issue is, does the Biden administration mark a paradigm shift in trade relations? And I think the answer to that is no, that Trump's policy was transactional. I think Biden's policy will be transactional in its nature. I guess the EU-US steel deal sort of could be held up as evidence of that. And so I think what we have is more of the same. And I think the key issue here for companies trying to navigate this changing environment is that the re-emergence of significant amounts of jurisdictional risk, that is what's happening at the moment, drives a wedge between the cost of capital that a local firm faces in any jurisdiction and the cost of capital that a transnational or a multinational company faces in a particular jurisdiction. And obviously capital will tend to be priced in favor of the domestic company, which means that the market in itself will start to drive a decoupling in the global economy. But I think it goes further than market forces. I mean, what we have seen, I think, out of China really since WTO accession and their rise has been a demonstrable willingness to politicize their economic relations and the use of sort of economic statecraft to further geopolitical ends. They're not unique in that respect in any regard. But what we're seeing now, as we sort of go into this multipolar world, bear in mind that when China came into WTO, the US was 10 times larger than China in terms of economic size. It's now, you'd measure the difference in percentage points, not multiples. So what we're seeing as we go into this multipolar world, I think, is the re-emergence of geopolitics as a sort of a permanent feature governing economic relations. And that means that a lot of business models that have been put in place in the period between 2000 and now are seriously challenged. And so, what's the solution for companies trying to navigate this? Because I don't think that we're going to get much succor from the institutional framework, the multilateral framework that exists. And clearly, I'd argue three things. You need to diversify supply chains and customer bases. You need to plan ahead. I mean, how many people actually have a file on what they would do on the day that Taiwan gets embargoed or Taiwan gets invaded? And people need to be prepared for big geopolitical events like that. And the third issue is how do you prevent yourself becoming a victim? How do you structure your business in such a way that the costs of action against your business are going to be felt by the people who are imposing that intervention, as it were. And so, to me, those are the big challenges that companies are facing in navigating what is, I think, inevitably going to be a bifurcating global economy.
Thank you, Stuart. Masamichi, can we turn to you next?
Okay, I will go next. And first of all, thank you for having me a speaker today for this discussion on timely and interesting topic. I'd like to begin by reviewing how global trade, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, has been developed for a couple of decades. Since the end of the 1990s in the Asia-Pacific region, business activity has become cross-border, and in tandem with the liberalization of trade and investment led by a bundle of trade agreements, there had been a wide expansion of supply chains. And I think it is important that the development of FTAs in the region, including CPTPP, can be understood in this context, although there are some geopolitical implications. More specifically, many manufacturers have spread their production of components widely throughout the region, leading to modularization of manufacturing procedures and cross-border division of labor. I would say in the case of Japanese companies that they invested in and set up factories in countries with relatively low wages for the production of labor-intensive components. For example, China, especially in the very early of this century, and while producing more technologically advanced components in Japan. Through such kind of efforts, I think the company sought to build an efficient production network over the region. And in the Asia Pacific region, I think the spread of these supply chains has led to many components being produced in China and some ASEAN countries. In summary, it can be said that for the last 20 years or so, there has been a structure in which companies expanding their supply chains to increase efficiency and governments encouraging this through trade and investment liberalization and development of some trade rules. But this trend has been changing in recent years. First, of course, there is a conflict between the US and China. In 2019, trade between the US and China was about 50% lower than in 2018. Arguably, one of the reasons for this decline is probably the trade conflict between them. And 2020 is almost the same as 2019, although there is the issue of how to assess the impact of COVID pandemic. Anyway, it is true that confrontation between the US and China has had a certain impact on international trade. But at the same time, trade with China continues to be extensive even for US. You know that still 85% of the trade remains between the two countries. Many components such as small and medium-sized liquid crystal panels or insulators for lithium-ion batteries are in China's top share of the global market. And it could be said that we still continue to be dependent on China at the moment. Then I'd also like to turn to recent developments in this area. Under COVID pandemic, and a number of problems with the supply chain became apparent. Parts from China stopped coming in. This led to a halt in the production in Japan. Let me give you an example related to everyday life in Japan. Last year, immediately after the outbreak of pandemic, in February or March, face masks disappeared from markets and shops due to the interruption of the supply chain with China. And some Japanese manufacturers formerly not in mask industry began to produce them. In addition, supply chains are increasingly becoming an issue from a security perspective, as evidenced by the measures taken by US in relation to Huawei, SMIC, or ZTE. I think the Biden administration has not made significant changes in this direction from the Trump administration. And so in the context of the disasters, pandemics, or security considerations, there seems to be a strong policy focus on ensuring the resilience of supply chains rather than pursuing the efficiency, reducing the dependency on Chinese industry, for instance. In this context, I think it is important to consider how to strike a balance between efficiency and resilience, although efficiency may be sacrificed to some extent under this consideration. A range of considerations may include digital, cybersecurity, decarbonization, and human rights. Maybe some geopolitical tension can be added here to be considered. So how can companies continue to produce and supply their products to the market if they suddenly lose the supply of components from certain countries or companies by the reason I mentioned? So it is necessary to build a resilient supply chain in this sense. In this context, resilience would mean building self-contained or to some extent redundant production networks, mainly in their home countries or any other countries than those with such risks, even if they are somewhat inefficient. For industry side, I think this is a major challenge. This is because the investment decisions related to the establishment of new production sites and supply chains need to take into account not only profitability and efficiency, but also force measure and policy risks in these supply chains. However, this is not an easy decision to make actually, and rebuilding a supply chain once it has been established is not something that can be done overnight. In summary, I think that the basic perspective from which to understand the dynamics of trade policy today is from efficiency to resilience. The policy of the US, the EU, and other major players would be re-examined from this perspective. And again, this can be a major challenge for industry. This is my introduction comment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Masamichi. Yuejia, let's turn to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. And also, firstly, let me thank my colleagues Sam and John for putting up this wonderful conference together. I'm Jie. I come from Chatham House, so not just Asia program, but Chatham House. Secondly, I mean, what I've noticed that both speakers have mentioned the word resilience, and I gather that perhaps China is also considering its own economic resilience as well in here. Now, since 20 years on, since China joined WTO, of course, I mean, the sheer size of the Chinese economy has expanded enormous, and not even within estimation of many of the Chinese leaders. But then what we have so far is that much of the Chinese economy has now been exposed into this global trade market. And one thing I think very much a wake-up call, not just the COVID, but even doing for the trade war between China and the United States happening in 2018 and 2019 onward, I think the Chinese leadership already consider how are they going to reassure on certain Chinese industries, and also try to building its own economic resilience. I mean, the one word which I have to mention in here that I've also invite to all of you in here, have a look onto the Chinese latest, the 14th five-year plan. The word of dual circulation has been mentioned many times. I think part of the reason why the Chinese government introduced the dual circulation, it is precisely it wants to restore its own economic resilience, also reassure its supply chain. So firstly, we're talking about these layers of internal domestic demand and supply, then obviously that made up on the domestic production and the consumption. That's one layer. Now the second layer, it is on the external demand and supply, and that's the traditional growth model that China has in the past by continuing on exporting manufacturing products. So what we have so far is that we're having a large number of the Chinese companies and redistributed its own financial resources, either it's a state capital or private capital back home, and building the domestic production chain. So that's first reason. Now, secondly, you also see that many of the Chinese companies giving the regain its focus back to the Asia Pacific region, not necessarily further afar, such as in Latin America or in Eastern Europe, like what China has emphasized in the last 10 years or so. Interesting picture that exactly to what extent would you consider the national security as well as the economic developments go all together? Again, what I found really interesting is that the time when Xi Jinping mentioned this, that he wanted to introduce the so-called holistic approach on national security. And that is also implied that reassure is a supply chain and strengthen China's supply chain is part of the root cause for that as well. So, so I think China is not alone. I think that many parts of the world are already thinking about its own supply chain issues. So I shouldn't think it's irrespective whether you're a market economy or non-market economy, and naturally you would consider for the national security reasons you want to building the resilience in the supply chain for itself. Now, what really put China a really interesting case in here, I think is firstly the sheer size, and secondly is that the latest perspective promoted by and the presidency, the so-called Common Prosperity Initiative, that closing the income gap between the rich and poor and within the Chinese society. But by doing that, and obviously that would require job creation. But so far, what we have seen in the trade patterns for China are mostly a physical manufacturing trade, and so little has been introduced and expanded on the service trade and on digital trade. And if the Chinese government are very serious about this common prosperity perspective and initiative, and of course, they will have to expand the service in trade sector and also in digital trade sector. So this brings my third point. At international level, we are going to expect that China to be a much more proactive player by setting the trade standards on digital trade and also on trading services. So I think really after 20 years of WTO, China will become a simple rule follower into agenda setter for the international trade. But I think what we should be really careful is that to go forward, I think the golden age that the China open economic globalization was open on, that age is over. I think instead, China has now become very choosy in terms of what kind of foreign direct investment they would like to accept. And secondly, very choosy in terms of what kind of trade negotiation that China would like to put forward to and what kind of trade agenda that China would like to set up. So I think the battleground between China and the United States will extend it into many frontiers, not just in the trade, but in many other trade negotiations in the decades to come.
Thank you, Yue Jie. And you spoke directly to a point I wanted to bring up toward the end of your answer there, where you said that this era that we've been in of sort of openness has come to an end definitively. And maybe I will put that back to you, Masamichi and Stewart, and just get your sense. Is there any going back, or do you feel that the direction of travel in terms of relations between the US and China, and perhaps also sort of attitudes toward global trade more broadly, are only going to move farther in this direction of kind of prioritizing national interests and things of that nature? Maybe Stewart, if you'd like to answer first.
Well, I'd start by actually questioning the sort of premise that we've been through a golden era of Chinese openness. I think there's been a tremendous asymmetry in the degree to which the Chinese economy has been open, but maybe that's semantic. In terms of the inevitability of the directional travel or not, I feel that it is inevitable. I mean, I think the key thing to create the overriding requirements to create a more symmetric and therefore sustainable trade relationship between China and the rest of the world are criteria that the CCP simply won't entertain. SOEs are not going to be removed from the commanding heights of the Chinese economy. The capital account is not going to be liberalized. We're not going to move to a market-driven exchange rate. We're not going to remove the industrial subsidies by which China has gained this tremendous market share in manufacturing and trade. And so in the absence of that kind of wholesale move to a genuine market economy, then I think that there is a sad inevitability about the requirement for both China and the rest of the world to move towards this sort of economically inefficient, perhaps, but more sustainable resilience overriding consideration.
Masamichi?
Yes, I think in short term, this direction, I mean, the confrontation between the US and China will continue because at this moment, for me, it seems that Biden administration is not so focusing on trade issues, international issues. Rather, they are focusing on domestic issues. That will mean at this moment for US government, in terms of trade, human rights issues or forced labor issues, such kind of issues are much more important than other trade related issues because they have to focusing on domestic issues and also they have to express what they are going in terms of international trade policy. They have to show to their domestic voters. So that means at this moment there's no sign for US side to change their position at this moment. So I mean, in short term, the situation will not change. That is my understanding at the moment.
Thank you. So from the audience, we have a question from John Aizentuk from the Department for International Trade. He asks, how active should governments be in engineering redundant supply chains for the private sector to support supply chain resilience? And and this is a question I sort of had as I listened to your opening remarks. To what extent is a move toward redundancy or resiliency going to be driven by, private sector firms making a calculation about what's in their own interest, and to what extent is it about, or should it be about, the government taking steps to encourage this a move in this direction? Yue Jia, would you like to answer that?
Well, obviously, I mean, for private sector, the key thing in here is return on investment. To what extent, if we're talking about market economy in here, to what extent that the government can persuade the redundant supply chain that we back and to make sure to increasing the level of return on investment that allow the private sector with the sense of enthusiasm to participate in the market economy. I think the answer is quite ambivalent here. Perhaps China can do it because China is not market economy, it's a state-led capitalism. So, I mean, state-led capitalism. So I wouldn't, have a perfect answer for this. But really, if we'd like to reassure the supply chain, you probably would need to get more state subsidies to the private sector. I know this is a really unorthodox answer for anyone who considers themselves as being market purists, but unfortunately, that's the scenario we're facing now. And also, just being perfectly frank, I mean, United States is not total market economy either. I mean, look at what happened with the trade phase one trade deal, for example. What Donald Trump has offered is a market distortion on agriculture sector between China and the United States and the world. Is not necessarily how the market economy should be practiced on this term.
Thank you. Stewart, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Dr. Yu's quite right to point out the irony that in the defensive market economies, we're now talking about the degree to which we need the state to ensure they survive. But I think the answer to the question is that there is a role for government. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that interventionist outside of specific areas which are obviously critical to national infrastructure and defense. And I think that's the debate that the conundrum that policymakers have to wrestle with is, where do we draw the line between industries that are so essential to the ability of the state to function and those industries that are nice to have, but where actually a market solution among like-minded countries that are approaching these issues in the same way, the market left to its own devices can actually build more resilience into those supply chains. And we've mentioned CPTPP, and I think that I hold out a lot of hope for that grouping for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's come together because people are keen, the members are keen to push forward with the deepening and modernization of trade infrastructure. Secondly, and most importantly, perhaps, there isn't a superpower involved in the grouping. And I think the grouping will thrive so long as that remains the case. And the time for that grouping to engage with superpowers is when it's deepened, it's worked for a while, and it's expanded to a level at which the grouping holds a lot of leverage over the superpowers. And I think this is a great opportunity for the United Kingdom, for example, to build more resilience into our supply chains with politically like-minded countries. So in short, I believe there is a role for the state in specific industries that are critical, but I think actually negotiating a good trade framework amongst like-minded nations is the best thing the state can do to build resilience into private sector supply chains.
Thank you. Masamichi, you mentioned that supply chains are moving from instancy to toward resiliency, and so what's your take on this?
Yes, actually, the countries other than China, the economy. So the basic idea here is some investment for establishing supply chain will be made by private sectors, but there is some, as I mentioned, it is very challenging for industrial sectors because there is many invisible risks, maybe the policy risks or the risks whether government's decision will continue or change. So I think there will be necessary for government to show their will for any kind of interventions. For example, any giving any incentives or preparing some subsidies. They have to show their will to establish some redundant but resilient supply chains by the government support. So I think if there's no government intervention in terms of resilience, maybe a private sector cannot make a big decision because it is, not in line with the benefit of stakeholders or stockholders. So I think I don't know how or what what extent the government intervention should be, but maybe any size of government intervention can be introduced. I think that will be the point.
Okay, so let's just staying on this before we move on to a slightly different subject. We have a question from Brenda Smith from Expeditors, who asks how private sector entities can support resilience in the larger trade environment. And I guess maybe we should, if we could try to sort of spell out perhaps in a little bit more detail. Does it mean diversifying your supply chain so that you're producing in more locations? Does it mean carrying larger inventories? Kind of what does, on the private sector side, what does increasing redundancy and resilience look like? Masamichi, should we stay with you?
Yes, I talked about the government intervention, and also I talked about the difficulties for private sectors to make decisions on such kind of investment. But I think it is the establishing a resilient supply chain is also beneficial for private sectors. If they don't take care of the resilience, just seeking efficiency, maybe they will front with some risk or some shortage of, for example, if the private sector doesn't see any importance on resilience and just investing to seeking the efficiency, maybe it can be also risk for private sector. So I think private sector have to think to invest in I don't know, there is some governmental intervention, but even if there's no governmental intervention, private sector has to think of resilience to protect themselves, I think.
Okay, Yuejia, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I mean, part of the element what we haven't spoken about in here is some rising labor costs. I think perhaps in certain government to reassure their supply chain. I think really what we have forgotten to factor in here is the labor cost that really taking a huge account. So even if we're talking about diversify from China, I think this process has already happened irrespective of COVID or not. It's because rising labor costs didn't happen inside China already. It's not just the foreign company does it, but I think the Chinese companies have done the same thing at the same time.
I see. So we have which is, do you all have thoughts about the UK's trade pivot toward the Asia Pacific as part of its global Britain agenda. And perhaps we could sort of broaden this out a little bit to other rich economies that are looking on at US and China tensions and kind of wondering what the right approach is. What's their role going to be in the trading environment moving forward? And Stuart, can we go to you with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'll just make a general point, which is that the middle powers, of which the UK is one, now it's left the sort of EU's sort of super bloc as a trader, benefit much more or have more at stake in the multilateral trading system than the more autarkic trade superpowers. They have potentially much greater benefits to reap from the multilateral trading system. I think the pivot to Asia makes huge sense. I mean, the UK's been obviously very EU orientated, a result of 40 years of policy. Question, I mean, at national level as well, diversifying your trade partners is an important part of risk reduction. So it makes perfect sense. There is, of course, a lot more to the Asia Pacific than China, and I wouldn't interpret a pivot to Asia as being a pivot to China. Far from it. I think the opportunities for the United Kingdom in Asia ex China are tremendous. The different factor endowments, etc., different cost structures, and the potential for a deep trade framework through CPTPP, bodes very well. Just coming back to the previous question, though, I was just talking now about a national level, but at the company level, the corporate level, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's an element of distance, complexity in supply chains that needs to be addressed, inventory as well, but that should all be guided by a proper risk-adjusted cost of capital. And if you risk adjust, companies become so used to nothing going wrong and operating on these razor-thin margins of error, and the world isn't like that anymore, right? So people have to build in risks, proper risk assessment into their supply chains.
Yuijia, is sort of staying on this topic. Is there room for agenda setting by other rich economies like the UK, like Japan? Are they going to be able to sort of drive the trade agenda agreements like CPTPP, things of that nature?
Well, of course, I mean, there's plenty of space for advanced economies to do that, because I mean, what UK is really essentially trying to sell to Asia Pacific economies on this trade on services. It's not on the traditional sense of the physical trade. So there's plenty of space to offer for the UK to be able to do that. But the problem in here with the UK and also with the Asia Pacific economies, that is the problem is on politics, it's not on economics, is that the Asian economies are so used to choose between China and the United States, and they're so accustomed to it already. And also don't forget that China is already a larger trading partner with many of the RCEP members, much larger trading volumes compared with the United States. So China already had an advantage for that. But I think that the advanced economy has their own distinctive contribution they could be able to make is on trading services, which is something that China hasn't really yet reached that level.
Thank you. And Masamichi, can we go to you as well?
Yes, I think that the trade policy has some aspects. One is about supply chain aspects, and also we have to take care of the rule making aspects, I think. And the recent efforts by Asia Pacific countries, including CPTPP, I understand that is an effort to establish the rule-based economy, and also some establishing trade rules in a new area. For example, in the information area of information technology, intellectual property, any issues, but through CPTPP or any other trade pacts, we can establish such kind of rules in the region. And in that context, I think
So Marianne Petzinger from Chatham House asks, what is driving China's ambition to join the CPTPP and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement? What are the prospects for accession, and if successful, what would the implications be for trade? Stewart, what do you think? What are the prospects for Chinese accession to CPTPP and the DPA? What's driving it, and what would the effects be if they were to join those agreements?
Well, I think what's driving it is geopolitics. That if China's ambition is to make itself entirely central to the operation of the Asia-Pacific economy, the last thing that it wants is a grouping of countries forming potentially a very progressive trade bloc in which it isn't a part, and therefore CPTPP is potentially a threat to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Of which China is very much the dominant economy. I mean, in RCEP, China makes up about 50% of the aggregate GDP. And so CPTPP, I think, it could be seen from a Chinese perspective as a real threat to its own centrality to supply chains. And a lot of China's geoeconomic power has come from the fact that it has managed to enmesh itself in global supply chains in a way that makes itself indispensable. However little or much value added might take place in China, the reality is that a huge amount of the volume of trade goes through it. And of course, this accrues enormous leverage, political leverage to China. So CPTPP is clearly a threat to that. In my view, the chances of accession are extremely low, because I think that the strength of CPTP is the fact that it is about people who are not following this sort of state-led, statist approach, and that I think China would struggle in terms of the letter, in terms of the intention of the rules of CPTPP to meet criteria in terms of state-owned enterprises, mobility of data, etc., and protection of intellectual property. So I would attribute a low probability to that. In terms of the data side of things, I think this is more about standard setting and trying to establish international norms. And obviously, in areas where those international norms are evolving rapidly because it's a relatively new area, clearly there's sort of perceived to be a first mover advantage getting in there and putting groupings together and what have you. So again, I mean, I fear that the world is going to be bifurcated in terms of data norms, but we'll see on that. But for CPTPP, I think the chances of accession are very low. I think the key driver is geopolitical, and what the grouping should be about is actually trying to take some of the geopolitics out of trade, and therefore I think that the grouping would be better off without China.
Jia, can I get your reaction to that?
Sure. Yeah. Yes, I mean, the probability it is low. I mean, it will be incredibly difficult for China, especially as being, state-led economy. So one of the major controversy in here is whether Xi Jinping would allow that state-owned enterprises play a lesser role in terms of its own economic activity. So perhaps I think within short term, we won't see that going to make changes. But however, let's not forget, I mean, what China was trying to do, I mean, like back to 20 years ago, what China trying to join WTO is really to use the external forces to facilitate internal changes. So perhaps they are certainly reminded in Chinese economists and argue that perhaps joining CPTPP is a good opportunity, or at least to make an attempt to join the CPTPP. is a good reason to do so. Now, secondly, I think what China really need is probably going to really need in the proper commercial rule of law or corporate rule of law in place in order to join the CPTPP. And obviously that would make China a better place to invest and better place to do trading. But so far, I think the stay on the subsidies, firstly, and secondly, the rule of law on this twin element is not there. If it's not there, then I think the prospect of admission is very low. But however, this does not prevent China to make the attempt. And also just to set itself in the stark contrast compared with the United States, that Biden has said he's not really interested in talking about any trade deals or trade agreement on his first term. So I think what China is also trying to do is trying to set up itself as being a contrast compared with the United States.
Thank you. So we haven't really talked much about the other big economic bloc in the world, which is the EU. Recently, the U.S. and the EU sort of resolved their dispute over steel and aluminium in a way that seemed sort of targeted at China. So I guess I'd put to the panel, how do you see Europe's role in the trading environment moving forward? Is it mostly going to be thinking in terms of geopolitics or economic benefits? And I'm just opening that up to everyone. Masamichi, would you like to go first, or?
Yes. Actually, geopolitics and economy is now closely related, and especially in the EU's involvement in Asia Pacific, it can be geopolitical, and at the same time, it can be economically some meaningful things. I think. Anyway, yeah, I think establishing a resilient supply chain can be done through the cooperation between like-minded countries, and I think some, of course, EU can be like-minded countries in this perspective. So I think maybe that supply chain will not be limited in the Asia Pacific, but in the broader meaning, they can make some contribution to establishing the resilience in terms of the such kind of supply chains. And also, I think I just mentioned CPTPP is an effort to establish some rule-based economy, and in terms of this, maybe EU also can contribute to something. So the establishing rules about data or rules about cybersecurity or anything. Maybe there's some. I think there's some rule. Some room for the EU to play some important role here, and that is my understanding at this moment.
Stuart, can we turn to you next?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'll just make a couple of points. I mean, firstly, the EU's trade relationship with China is in aggregate incredibly asymmetric, right? And it's worth pointing out that within the EU, sort of half of the EU's exports to China come from Germany, just one country, right? It's a big country, but so the importance of China is not spread evenly throughout the community, the union. And even within Germany, exports to China are actually less than 3% of GDP. Okay, so the trade linkages between the EU and China are actually not that great. That obscures the fact that, of course, you do have a large number of European multinational corporations operating in China, where the economic benefits of that are obviously very different from trade. We're just here measuring a profit stream that's being repatriated. And what we've seen in aggregate there is actually the profitability of those EU operations in China has actually been rather disappointing. So Volkswagen, for example, who disclosed this kind of thing, they're making less money in China now than they were in 2012. So it's not been the sort of panacea for Europe's own stagnation, economic stagnation. And so I think actually what we're seeing going forward is you'll be particularly autos that tend to dominate that German relationship, autos and chemicals that dominate that German relationship with China. We're seeing a big shift in attitudes now that actually as China moves up the value chain, they're actually looking to eat the lunch of these European multinationals that are operating in China. They're after that technology and they want to usurp their dominance in those industries. And so it seems to me that European or EU trade objectives with regards to Asia are becoming more aligned with American objectives. And I think that that's reflected in an attitudinal change in the EU towards China. And obviously the failure to ratify the comprehensive agreement on investment, despite the best part of a decade of negotiations, is perhaps testimony to that. So I do actually see, although the EU's sort of stated objective of an independent trade policy pursuing European interests, not just being a sort of adjunct to the United States, they've made that pronouncement actually at a time when I think there's a greater degree of harmony in their interests than there probably has been for a while in the trade sphere. So that does hold up a prospect potentially for greater collaboration amongst market-orientated economies going forward. The difference, I think, the big difference between the United States and the EU, I think, in terms of policy attitude at the moment, is the EU still seems to have a sort of unshakable faith in the World Trade Organization and its ability to handle the architecture of global trade. I think it's fair to say that faith is lacking in the United States, even with the change of administration. So that would be the big difference I see. From an EU point of view, I mean, we haven't mentioned carbon yet and carbon border adjustments and the impact of that on global supply chains and the fragmentation, if you like, of the global trading system has the potential to be huge. And for either good reasons or ostensibly using carbon as a geoeconomic tool to exclude certain trading partners or disadvantage certain trading partners. So it might be an absolutely admirable objective, but it's also potentially a policy that can be used in a sort of an aggressive way. I would just throw that out there in the mix in terms of where the EU might be going.
Thank you. I hope to squeeze in a quick climate question at the end here, but first I'll go to you, UAG, and just get your sense of the European question.
Sure. European question, I mean, putting this way, I think this a paradigm the Kai did not go through at this stage, but for quite obvious political reasons. So I think so far the both sides is really in terms of the relationship, is really in a stalemate. And also, let me perhaps put in something quite controversial in here. Irrespective Kai or no Kai, the implication towards the Chinese economy on the Chinese GDP data is barely minimal. So I think that's perhaps part of the reason why the Chinese government has decided not to put forward on CAI.
Well, we have just a few minutes to go, but Stewart raised the issue of carbon border adjustments and things of that nature. We have a question from the audience on whether, as climate change becomes more of a pressing issue, we might see the emergence of green blocs or trade policies motivated by climate policies in which there are insiders and outsiders. And I suppose I'll start with you, Masamichi. Do you see this as becoming a thing that defines trade relationships and which might be used to establish certain trade blocs?
Yes. I think the decarbonization is one factor to be for consideration in making supply chain. For example, maybe some if there in supply chains some manufacturers require some environmental consideration to their suppliers, maybe there will be some change of supply chain or some change of the attitude of companies involved in supply chain. So maybe it may be the factor when we consider about the what will be the forthcoming supply chains over the world. So, but I'm sure about what kind of measure is best to establish such kind of supply chain. You know that there's some border measures are discussed in UK and the EU. So still that scheme, that framework is to be formally established. So we have to. We have to see where they are going, and also whether it is beneficial to pursue some green industry or green supply chain. We are not sure at this moment, but anyway, the climate change will be the very big issues, very big factors in the supply chain. That is my understanding.
Yue, GM?
Sure. I mean, obviously, this is hugely important. I think this is perhaps a lesson that Chinese companies will have to learn very quickly, in order to meet the climate standard and also for the labor standard that certain international organization put forward to. But I think another added element in here, come back to my dual circulation story. So the layers of external circulation, and much to do is that what China is interested in doing, it is to expanding its export on high value added equipments for things like renewable energy. The part of the reason why China is very keen to push on this renewable energy and the green agenda, it is also to consider to place its renewable energy equipments as being part of the increasing earning, and also to make sure that will be added for the international balance of payment. So I think there's an economic reason behind as well for the green agenda.
Thank you. And Stewart, back to you. You brought up climate. Do you have more? Do you like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious point I'd make is that China's GDP is about 3 times as carbon intensive per unit as the EU, and similar number for America, although America is slightly higher than Europe. So if we do go down this road of carbon adjustments at the border, which I think we will be doing, companies whose supply chains are heavily reliant on China at the moment are going to have to rejig them anyway. So, you've got the twin factors of sort of geopolitics, resilience, and carbon that are all pointing towards a big decoupling from China, which poses, obviously some significant challenges for the Chinese economy, given that manufacturing base that has been put in place, that it's far too big for its domestic requirements. So a period of big change ahead, I think.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's just about all the time we have today. So I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us and for contributing your knowledge and wisdom. Thank you to Yue Jie, to Masamichi Ito, and to Stewart Paterson. And thank you to the audience for your questions and for listening. And finally, thank you again to the sponsors, AIG, Diageo, IHS Markets, and the Henrik Foundation. We appreciate you being with us today.